Welcome to another episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Acton, and Tom van der Lubbe. This time, we're going to take a look at this book. Who's watching Tom Salding? What's that, the Dutch version or the German version?
No, it's a Dutch version. I wrote
version. I've got the English version here.
I read that.
The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good by Michael J Sandel. He's a political philosophy professor at Harvard. He's also been quite the media figure with some very popular series. He's also the author of Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? And now has this book, Tyranny of Merit. So you chose this, Tom. Perhaps it's best again for you to intro it and just sort of take us through the main structure of the book, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, why I chose this, on the one hand, it's a pretty well-known book, so it has been on the bestseller list, which is for a topic like meritocracy astonishing or interesting. That's one reason. The second reason is that what I like is, I'm always quite skeptical about this whole idea of the sky's the limit and the American idea of the American dream. I often quote, if you believe in the American dream, you should move to Denmark. Because, let's say from a statistical point, the social mobility in other parts of the world is much higher. So I found it interesting to dive into this topic by taking this example of a professor who is a professor at Harvard, and he was a philosopher and talks about this whole big idea of meritocracy.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating way in, I think, to this problem that most of the West is now facing around inequality. He makes some very powerful arguments against meritocracy, which I really enjoyed. So, do you want to start by taking us through the flow of the book?
What does he? Yeah, I can do. So what he does is what I think is very interesting. He dives into it, and especially, let's say, the first part I found very interesting in that way that this whole idea, we all have grown up with this idea of meritocracy, and I would say probably we are all big believers in this. So that's the starting point, and then you're reading the book, and then you start to question this whole idea of meritocracy, and that's more or less the starting point of the book. And that this whole idea of social mobility, that it has, on the one hand, has winners, but it also has losers, and that's the first part. And then it depends a little bit how we want to dive into this. I mean, he makes a lot of connections also to current politics and Trump, etc. But I think the starting point, more from a scientific point of view, would be, but that's a personal thing, is that this whole idea of meritocracy has this negative side, that in the past you could say, I don't have any chances. I'm a son of a farmer. I will stay a farmer forever. But then suddenly, in a world where our meritocratic system is the leading system, you can't say anymore, I was not able to do this. So this whole idea of social mobility has also a negative side. That means that somebody who's not successful, the whole framing has to blame him or herself, because you had the chances to become successful. And yes. I think that's a very powerful. So that would be, for me, the core of the whole book, so to say.
Yes, the sort of, if you like, the toxic side effects of, not that that's a phrase he uses, of meritocracy. And he contrasts the meritocratic mindset with the humility that exists outside of that. He uses this quote there, but for the grace of God or the accident of fortune go I. So that idea that I'm at the whim of God or universal forces is gone when we live in a meritocratic world. The perfect meritocracy banishes all sense of gift or grace. It diminishes our capacity to see ourselves as sharing a common fate. And he makes that point in the first chapter. And seen from below, the hubris of elites is galling. Nobody likes to be looked down upon. But the meritocratic faith adds insult to injury. The notion that your fate is in your hands, that you can make it if you try, is a double-edged sword, inspiring in one way, but invidious in another. Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on that, and especially you and I suppose, in some ways, who have ended up relatively near the top in the sorting mechanism. It's good to read a book like this in a way because he's laying it out from every possible vantage point in society.
There's a lot of people talking about this because it's a negative side of social mobility or meritocracy. And I think another thing is important to mention is that he quotes Michael Young, an Englishman who wrote the book The Rise of Meritocracy in 1958. And when I remember correctly, this was more somebody who was at the labor, let's say, side of the political spectrum, but already saw that there would be looked down upon, let's say, people who would not really make it, because in the past there was a kind of solidarity, and that's also what you see in. And he also describes this in the book about the political side, the political left wing. I think we'll come to that. And that this whole idea of solidarity changes because of this whole idea of, everybody had the possibilities. The question is this really the case or not? We'll also come to that. But I think the starting point, I didn't read the book, Michael Young, The Rise of Meritocracy. But what I found interesting is that somebody already saw this negative aspect, let's say 50 years ago, and said, okay, it has a positive side, meritocracy, but it also has a negative side.
Yeah. And he opens with the Trump phenomenon in 2016, and really attacks those who believe that somehow this was just about a bunch of angry racists who voted for Trump. And he says the hard reality is that Trump was elected by tapping a wellspring of anxieties, frustrations, and legitimate grievances to which the mainstream parties had no compelling answers. Well, and not just no compelling answer, but no respect for, right? If you think about Hillary Clinton and her deplorables. And so I think he's providing, I think, just another way to look at this whole phenomenon that we're all living through in terms of populist discontent.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So I think that's the second aspect of the book, which I find very compelling or very interesting, is that a lot of people, they still don't understand populism. And I think Michael Sandel is really one of the people who tries to explain why Trump, or also the Brexit, he explains it. So you have this, let's say, also left-wing politicians who are those exceptions and use the possibility of meritocracy to climb the social ladder, and they are disconnected to their voters, and that creates populism. And this kind, and the only one who understands this, or the only one, but in American context, is Trump, who understands this. In the Brexit context, you have exactly the same phenomena, that it's a kind of anti-vote. That's the only
voting with your middle finger.
That's the only possibility which is left, because everybody is not taking you seriously. And what he also explains in a very good way, I think, it's there's this whole aspect of smart and intelligent, etc. Everything is framed as smart, and those people left behind who are losing their jobs, and of globalization, the factories were moved to China, etc. They lost their jobs, but they not only lost their jobs, but they also lost their self-esteem. And I think he describes this in a very good and accurate way.
Yeah, and there was a couple of things that come to mind. He mentions in the book Trump's quote, "I love the poorly educated," right? And this idea that the non-smart people, or dumb people who didn't get to university, goes on to describe the way in which universities are sorting mechanisms, as he calls it. Means that you get an entire swathe of the population who feel looked down upon because they haven't gone to college, and they don't have voices in the political class. I mean, he makes the point later in the book that in 1979, 37% of Labour MPs came from a manual occupation background. By 2015, only 7% did. So from 37% to 7% over those decades, a drop in non-educated MPs in the UK. And in Germany's Bundestag, 83% of MPs are university graduates, fewer than 2% of high school vocational training, and then it goes on, other European nations and a similar situation in the US. But we've basically got a political class across the West pretty much entirely comprised of educated people.
Yeah. And what I like is the connection he makes with the whole American philosophy. That's also, I think, a major part of the book. You can make it if you try, which is just that has two sides. It's just, on the one hand, it's just not the case. And the people who have made it, they should understand that they were just lucky bastards. And this whole idea also in the language fortune is, in the end, let's say from a linguistic point, Fortuna means you were lucky. So if you are well off, you were lucky, Fortuna. But this whole connotation has disappeared. So this idea is, if I am successful, it's not because I was lucky, because I was a nobleman and I inherited the land of my family. No. If I'm very well off and if I'm successful, I don't have to be thankful. I was not fortunate. No, I was the guy who went to Ivy League university. I really studied a lot. And what I find very remarkable in the book is that there's a lot of numbers on how many people with which backgrounds attend Ivy League universities, and he's a Harvard professor. And then he describes in the book his students. And he asks his students, do you think you're lucky or you deserve it? And all this is, now we deserved it. We really worked for it. But he shows in the book that all those students from those Ivy League universities, they come from those rich neighborhoods. And so depending on your postal code decides, let's say, about social mobility in your life. So if I am, let's say, from a privileged background, you can just take the postal code or the zip code of your parents, and then you can say with very high accuracy what the chances will be that you will be on the social ladder at what, and you will have what status and what income. That's what statistics say. And we can dive into this chapter where he describes how the whole application process works of Ivy League universities. But what I find striking is, and I see this over and over, also successful entrepreneurs, etc., they always think they were just totally smart and much smarter than the rest of the crowd. Now, there's an enormous amount of luck involved. It doesn't mean that those people also really worked hard for it, etc. And perhaps they were also smart, but in the end, it's just this kind of coin, and then you can be lucky or you can be unlucky. And people should more reflect on the fact that they were lucky. And what I especially like in the book is the whole chapter about Obama, because what he does, I think, in a very good way is he uses also language, and what kind of words are used in those speeches, which I find a very strong part also. This kind of quantitative analysis of the way language is used in building this this culture and this kind of understanding.
Yeah, and this idea of the smart thing to do, right? That this constant refrain of, what's the smart thing to do, and I suppose that speaks to this almost this technocratic kind of entitlement that exists among the educated, who now obviously dominate the political class. Well, we're educated, we're the smart ones, we should know what to do. And I think that just causes such resentment. I remember speaking about Brexit to a celebrated academic who was baffled by why all these people in England, quote, voted against their interest. And I thought that really illustrated just, the level of arrogance amongst the educated class and the disdain that they have for the non-smart, for the Trump voters, for the Brexit voters. I wonder if we should go on. I was just going to say, and he winds it right back in chapter 2, called "Great Because Good." He winds all the way back to biblical theology, and contrasts the two features of the biblical outlook. One is its emphasis on human agency, and the other, its harshness towards those who suffer misfortune. And he talks about this anthropocentric God, which spends most of his time responding to the promptings of human beings, so rewarding their goodness, punishing their sins. God becomes paradoxically beholden to us, compelled insofar as he's just to give us the treatment we have earned. And so he's got this roots in that, we somehow deserve good or bad fortune, doled out by God, depending on our actions, given that we've got agency. And how, well, interestingly enough, this is something I've never really put together before. If we spin forward to the puritanical work ethic, it's out of that belief that God is watching us and is going to reward or punish us.
That's Max Weber. He also quotes Max Weber, which you don't often see in, let's say, American literature. But I live in the German-speaking part of Europe. In my book, it's page 56, and it's even it's the Protestant ethics, and Max Weber explains capitalism by religion. So let's say the Protestants are not able, or they're not allowed to spend, or they should live their sober lives. So the only thing is left is that all the money they earn, they can only invest in further growth, and then become even more, even richer, etc. But what I also find very interesting is what you just quoted. I didn't make this whole connection to the strong role of religion which it plays in American politics, and where he really understands that religion and the way of talking about America. I mean, often you have American politicians say the Bible and thank God and etc. But there's a much more intellectual level in this, and I think he explains this in a very, very good way, how these things are interconnected. or have become interconnected. So in the end, what he says is this: the American dream is connected to religion. So God helps those who have become successful, and that's a kind of using this Max Weber theory. So if you are successful, that's also a kind of reward by God, and this is in a very strong way interconnected. And on the other hand, something is interconnected, that America, as the big example and successful nation, it has become successful, and it is the biggest nation because it's God-given, so to say.
Yeah, it's God-given as a reward for our hard work. I mean, in the meritocratic understanding.
And the funny thing is that coming from a very small country in the Netherlands, if you just see, let's say, economic output per capita, or doesn't matter what kind of statistics, all those small countries are doing much better. So it's even from a statistical point of view, it's not even correct. So it's from a number, it's correct because the country is just much bigger. But if you would, let's say, economic output per capita, or criminal offenses, or life expectancy, etc., etc., and he also mentions this, that life expectancy goes down in the US. So there is a kind of statement, because we are the biggest country, we deserve this by God. But it's not even the case if you would take these economic numbers and you would divide them by the population, or if you would take life expectancy. And that's also what Michael Sandel explains.
Yeah, that's right. Although I think to some extent his argument, I don't know, seems to me to be undercut when he talks about this meritocratic sensibility existing is not just an American phenomenon. It's not just a Christian, phenomenon. Because he used this example of a Chinese student, responding to whether or not whether it's not rich people deserve to live longer, right? And the student says, having earned their wealth, rich people are meritorious and so deserve to live longer. But I suppose when I think about it, the Chinese society is similar in the sense that they don't revere a god. They don't have this this idea of by the grace of God go I. It's a very sort of materialistic, from what I understand of it, society. And so I wonder if the common theme is not so much it's not so much the theological underpinnings of the society. It's more to the extent to which it's materialistic.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk only about the meritocracy, it's not a specific American phenomena. But this combination of let's say deserving, in combination with, let's say, being very big, because that's the chapter where this chapter is all about. Then there is this American connotation, but the Chinese are in a way much more materialistic or capitalistic than the Americans. And so if you just see this, but it also has to do with kind of let's say that's also with former communist regimes. If you were not able to spend your money on cars and luxury goods, etc., and then suddenly you can, then you do as you want. There's a kind of maturity in your society, and if those material goods are just there, then people start to differentiate in another way, in a more intellectual way, or even buying less, and also talking about that they buy less, because the differentiator changes.
I wonder if we should talk a bit about, we've talked a little bit about how the role of educational institutions and the sorting machines, which seem to be the engine of this. I mean, the way his thesis seems to suggest, right, the engine of meritocracy is the institutes of higher education, and then he charts the there's this central figure at Harvard, James Bryant Conant, 19 and 1940s, president of Harvard University, who first started this project to open up admissions to Harvard and move it to be a more meritocratic system. And how he instituted these SAT tests, right? So which at least initially were thought to be a more pure assessment of intelligence, and opened up entry from a much bigger proportion of the population.
I find it a very strong part, because he explains that in the end, the conclusion was that it was counterproductive. So the starting point was a noble one. The idea was to give equal opportunities. So this old idea of meritocracy about social mobility. And then there are a lot of examples in the book where he shows that, let's say, if you are from a richer family and then you know a test, then you send your children to kind of pre-boarding, let's say, schools or classes where you spend money so that your children will have higher scores in this test. And then the effect is counterproductive.
Right.
And then he ends, what I find very interesting and very funny in a way, that a Harvard professor, let's say, attacks in the end the own, let's say, system, and says in the end, perhaps we just should do a kind of, he just takes an example, says, okay, throw all those applications down the hall and just take the worst or the best out of it, and just take the amount you want to admit, and just forget about all the stuff, etc.
Yeah,
and then you have this connection to voting or to choosing and elections in the Greek polis of Athens. People were just chosen. They just say, okay, Richard, you are in the parliament for this period. It was not asked if you would like to.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting proposal. He called it qualified lottery, right? That we, yeah. Yeah. Lottery of the qualified, yeah. As long as you meet a minimum standard, all of the applications above that minimum standard.
But what I didn't know is that if your parents spend a lot of money, I mean, there's a whole chapter on this. If they spend a lot of money and if they are a donor of this university, there are also places reserved at this university.
Right.
Which I mean, I didn't know that. I thought, okay, yeah, they spend money, etc. And I also know that you have, if you have more financial means, that the schools which let's say you send your children to, they have a higher chance of ending as an Ivy League university. But it even goes much further. I didn't know that there also were places reserved for people who just spend a lot of money.
Yeah,
a big donor.
Yeah, and he's pragmatic on that, right? He says that he could see Hawaii universities might still want to do that, but just maybe those kids get a few extra tickets in the lottery. I suppose there is a pragmatic argument you can make, not supporting it or not, but that these institutions, it's a way for them to get funding. So I thought that was it's fascinating to think that, I suppose, where he starts on one of the places he starts on how do we move away from this meritocratic society is to take the meritocracy out of higher education. And then this, chapter 7, he follows up. So that's looking at education. He now looks at recognizing work in a whole new way. And I suppose putting back the dignity and the respect and the honor for those people working in jobs that don't require a degree. And he also cites some history which I hadn't really I wasn't aware of before, about how, in the early days of the labor unions, that there was a huge emphasis on education, and they would insist on reading rooms within factories, and that, if you think about the modern day workplace, that doesn't really exist, does it? There's no project in that sense amongst labour unions to educate, to develop civic virtue amongst union members that I'm aware of. But he alludes to that in his chapter, Recognizing Work. It's both recognizing the value of these jobs, but also a commitment to the development of people, not just in terms of their vocational skills, but their broader development as human beings in those roles.
But what I find also interesting is, and there are some really intellectual bites in this book, is, for instance, the fact that the question is, did the social mobility really change if you take just more than a couple of centuries, or because the whole idea or the belief or the promise of meritocracy would be more justice. I mean, because he also refers to John Rawls and the theory of justice, I think, in the book. But let's say the starting point was, let's say, in the beginning of the 20th century, or even the end of the 19th century, if you would educate people with a labor background, that would be, and you would create social mobility, you would have a more correct society, or more justice in by creating these chances. Question is this whole experiment of meritocracy, was it successful or not? If the social mobility really didn't change, you can say, okay, as a whole, our society became more, let's say, affluent, but the social mobility perhaps didn't change. And then the big question to me is, and that's also the part I'm missing in the book, is in what countries are the differences between the salaries are the lowest? So if you take about this, let's say, CEO salaries is a good example, but let's say, if you say you can't solve this problem of meritocracy, and if your point of view would be everything is important in a society, why should a nurse have a lower salary than somebody who is a doctor, or let's say a doctor? Huh? I mean, that's a philosophical, ethical question. In what kind of society you're probably ending up in Scandinavia again? The more justice and less populism you have probably in societies where the differences between skilled labor and not non-skilled, or theoretical and practical labor, etc., are the lowest. And he doesn't dive into that topic, which I missed a little bit. And on the other hand would be, let's say, if you talk about universities, in what countries is it just possible to study without the means of your parents, without any difficult exams where your parents have to pay, let's say, to help you to get this entry ticket to Oxford or Cambridge or Ivy League university. So, and then also end up with, let's say, the more Scandinavian approach. Also, for instance, in the Netherlands where I studied, you had your normal school. I mean, there were different layers, but then everybody went to university. Or let's say a certain amount of people went to university, but it was not an entry exam to be able to study law or to study history or whatsoever. I just applied to university and I could go to university. That was it. So on the one hand, you have this kind of social mobility by the educational system. And on the other hand, you have, if you more zoom out from an ethical question, why should somebody who is at a theoretical schooled job or theoretical background, why should this person earn much more than somebody who does practical stuff? And would that be also a solution to avoid populism? Because that was the starting point, because he's extremely angry about Trumpism.
Yeah.
And also this arrogance of the elite, which thinks, okay, I don't have to thank anybody because I did it myself. And what I also find interesting is that he explains, which I also didn't realize that much, but I think he took it from Piketty, is that this political voting totally changed. So he then describes that, let's say, the people in the past who, let's say, were the highest layer of society were Republicans, and the Democrats or Labor or the left wing were, let's say, the parties who took care of underprivileged people, or the Labor blue collar people. And now it's exactly the opposite. So that the underprivileged, or the people who really fell, those people who feel ignored, they are voting on the right side of the political spectrum. They have become Republicans, so to say, and the intellectuals have become the one who vote for the Democratic Party. And he also describes Hillary Clinton and Obama, who, because of this system of meritocracy where they succeeded, they have forgotten how lucky they were. And they talk, Obama is the one who talks much more than any other president about smart and intelligent and social mobility, and everybody who wants to make it can make it, etc. But he doesn't understand that he is the exception to the rule.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and just valorizing his own intellect as virtuous in itself, right, and deserving, and that being something to be lionized, as opposed to considered as a gift from God, right? That's something that he has no right to take pride in. I think that's something that this meritocratic society gives us, right? It doesn't sort of accept that we have gifts from God that we've done nothing to earn, and that we should be humble in the face of that. And I'm guilty of that, right? I've definitely sourced some of my identity and pride from my own intellect. And that's, I think, an important point he makes in the book.
He also says, I think it's the only topic where it's still allowed to have to have discrimination. So and also I'm doing exactly the same. I also use it's dumb, or somebody doesn't understand, etc.
Yeah.
So it's I find it interesting, but it's this kind of technocratic behavior we have in our culture. And there's also a quote he quotes in Obama. He says, people who lost their jobs, they just didn't adapt fast enough to the changes. So, I mean, but if you work in a steel factory, it's not so easy with 50 to become a computer scientist or to become a developer, etc. So it's I mean, it's a little bit more complicated. So especially if you are working in certain industries which are just disrupted by globalization. If you work in a textile factory in the past, or if you work in a steel factory and it's moved to Korea or to China, what can you do? If you are a tax lawyer or a consultant or whatsoever, it's okay. Those people even got more work because of the globalization.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's what and he makes that point, right? That the gains of globalism have accrued to the educated, and in real terms, the uneducated have lost money over the course of globalization.
There's global competition. Where do you produce your textiles? But if you are a specialist for tax law in New York, for, I don't know, kind of legal entities, you are not competing with somebody in China who could do the the work for, let's say, just a fraction of your salary. And he also shows that those salaries go up. And those people tell those people who work in steel factories, you just didn't adapt to globalization. You should have done a computer course or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point about this sort of flip of the political parties, it just reminds me, I think last week, Tucker Carlson, the right-wing pundit for Fox News, was asked, if self-driving trucks do become available in the near future, would you support regulation to ban them to save the jobs of truck drivers? And Tucker Carlson, icon of the right in the American, said, in a heartbeat, yes, I would regulate. And I would ban self-driving trucks. So fascinating how that's now flipped. And I think that speaks to something else he says in the book, chapter 7, Recognizing Work. He makes the point that a lot of the economists who have shaped our modern society, he quotes Smith here, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. That's Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations. And the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only insofar as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. And then John Maynard Keynes proclaimed that consumption is the sole end and object of all economic activity. So there you've got two of the most influential economists, of our modern age, both putting consumer ahead of producer. And we see it in the mantra of so many of today's organizations. I mean, customer first. It's the modern mantra for business, right? And he's making the very strong point that that's not honoring the worker. That's not celebrating the contribution to the common good of the worker, and that's missing. That's missing, and that's why one of the reasons that we have so much despair, as he puts it. Right? It's that we've and why there is so much discontent is that we've stopped honouring the factory worker, both in terms of their share of the economic rewards, but just more generally in the way that they get described in political discourse. And that's something he sees as needing to change.
Yeah, I think it has those two aspects. On the one hand, we have to honor more the stuff which really matters, and their let's say the whole globalization went in the wrong direction. Let's say what we just explained. If you talk about the factory worker, but in a way, it's the same with people who work in hospitals and teachers, etc., or people cleaning the streets, etc. And the amount of salary rises of people who do a lot of stuff where you really have to question it. David Graeber bullshit jobs. Is this really something which creates value for a society? That's one thing. But on the other thing, I think is that if you really, I think a lot of skilled people believe in this idea of meritocracy. But I think after reading this book, you become more humble. Because you think, okay, what is merit and what has been luck? And we know this, but in such a strong way, Michael Sandel confronts the reader with it, is, let's say, is to my point, exceptional, because he has so many aspects he takes, where he just says, you're just a lucky bastard. And you should at least realize, and he in the book he takes Obama as the most example, which he in a way punishes with his scientific way of research, and then also explaining that one of the reasons Trump won was also the fact that this left-wing intellectuals, and not only Obama, but also Hillary Clinton, etc., and you have this all over the place, were not humble enough.
Yeah.
They were not humble enough.
And they've not been trained to be humble. I mean, that's the point, right? They've actually been trained in the opposite direction to lionize their own intellect. They're being told at all these elite schools, you're the top. And I've had this, right? When I first joined Arthur Andersen as a management consultant, I remember one of the first meetings, you are the cream de la creme of university. You've beaten thousands of people to be working here. You're a special boy, right? Like always telling you to construct your identity and your sense of your own worth through purely my intellect, which, I was born with good genes and, had a great middle class upbringing that meant, that celebrated education and supported me with my homework and all the rest of it. So, at no point was I ever instructed to be humble.
And that's what I find, if I really have put it in one word. This magazine is called Fortune.
Mm.
And Fortune is Fortuna. You're just a lucky bastard.
Yeah.
So I think it's a kind of, if we want to avoid populism, or if we want to avoid revolution, or if you want to avoid more of the stuff we have seen with Trump and also Brexit and also other, let's say, populist tendencies, I think we have to look into the mirror, become more humble when we are on a more privileged position in society. And on the other hand, we should, let's say, take this kind of self-esteem. I think it's a lot about self-esteem. We should understand that if you want to keep society together, we have to honor a huge part of society in a totally different way. If we compare this with what we're doing now.
Yeah, and then again, we talked about what may be missing from the book. I don't think he had a very good answer, because he talks about this need for a public conversation about the virtue of different roles in society, but I just don't see where that venue emerges. Like I don't think the state's going to provide it. Like maybe educational establishments provide it for those who go there, right? But that's, as he points to, right, that's only a small section of society.
He refers, but not very profoundly, to Piketty. Eh?
Mm.
So Piketty has done a lot of proposals in that direction. And then there's the whole topic of inequality. How do you solve this? So in the end, it's a very simple answer. You have to tax those people much stronger. But the starting point is people have to understand that if they're more privileged, that they were lucky. So that's their honor and their duty to pay back, because they were just lucky bastards.
Yeah.
But if you don't feel the need to thank society that you were lucky, you say, no, I all deserved it and I did it myself. I didn't need any help from anybody. Then as this kind of ethical, philosophical self-reflection is just not there anymore. And that's why I find Obama so interesting. So he knows he's the exception, first Black American president, went through the ranks. He is an intelligent guy, no doubt about this. But he should have more aware that telling people, if you want to make it, you can make it in God's own country. That's just not the case.
I think that's right. And something he doesn't, because for me, an answer to that, and I say this as somebody who is not a practicing Christian. In fact, I don't practice any religion. The obvious answer to that place where we can have this conversation and we can be encouraged to be humble and we can be encouraged to look out and reach out to fellow men and women and offer a hand of charity. That would have been the church. But of course, interestingly, he makes the case that where we are right now started with a theological impetus, if you like. So I don't. I don't think the book answers it. I certainly don't have an answer to that. But what encourages that conversation? What encourages that self-reflection? What encourages that humility? What is the force in society that does that? And I don't think it's the state. I mean, one of the things he talks about is, do we tax the financial industry more because they're only 15% or something of financial activity contributes to the real economy? He makes that point. Do we subsidize the wages of working people? And so these, in a sense, are technocratic answers to how we solve inequality. And that perhaps, solves part of the problem, but it doesn't address this bigger problem of the cohesiveness of society and avoiding situations where politicians describe half of the population as deplorable, right? Like that, I'm still left at the end of the book thinking, what's the answer to that? And certainly I think some people do think that's in religion, and we see a rise of the Christian right in the States right now. And there's a massive interest in, and I've noticed recently that Christian nationalism, a book was hugely popular on Amazon and is very popular in right-wing circles in the States. So there are obviously a lot of people who feel like it is a return to religion. Is that the answer? Is that the way that we're going to see society go? I don't know, but if I really wanted to chat through that.
I think what he could have added is that if it's about trust in society, in the institutions, in your neighbors, etc., etc. There's a correlation with inequality. So if you would just, if let's say low-paid jobs would be paid better, and people would have less, let's say, anxiety about sending their people to school, etc., etc. That's the main topic. I mean, if you lose your job, and then you also know that you can't send your children to college, etc., it's all interconnected. So if these things are separate, and the state cares about education or hospitals whatsoever, no matter if you have a job or not, or a low-paid or a high-paid job, it creates an enormous rest in society. And I think that still is the European model if you compare this with the US. And that's also what I'm missing in the end of the book. But in Europe, we're going down the same road. So I think it's also kind of, it's also interesting to read about, let's say, the situation in the US, because normally you have the same developments just 10 or 20 years later in our own societies.
Well,
privatization of the whole education is a huge topic nowadays.
Yeah. Well, which is another example, right? I mean, it's a sort of consumerist approach to it, right? It's like, what's the end product? What can I do with it? It's not about developing the learner and their character and so on. So it's certainly not critical thinking. Yeah. Okay. Well, great to have had the opportunity to review this. Thank you. It was a great suggestion. I'm also thinking I'd love to get Michael Sandel on my other podcast and grill him on some of his questions. So I'll definitely ask him. Good. All right. Well, thanks once again. We'll be back with another book for the next episode. But thank you, Tom, for your time.
Thank you, Richard.
I enjoyed it.
Talking about the book.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my fantastic co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material in this show resonated with you, if you're thinking, perhaps, how could I take these ideas and apply them in my own leadership or take them forward into my own organization, then I would love to have a conversation with you about that. If that feels like that could be a valuable use of your time, then please do click on the Calendly link in the description for this episode, and that will allow you to book a slot directly into my calendar. And I hope to speak to you soon.